Across the street from Tri County Mall in Springdale, Ohio, was a shopping center, kind of a strip mall. It's still there, but in the late 1980s, it had a TCBY, which stands for the country's best yogurt. And next door to TCBY was a record store that only sold gospel and contemporary Christian albums and tapes. I don't remember the name of the store, but up the street was another record store in another strip mall called Record and Tape Outlet. Record and Tape Outlet sold all the heathenish, sinful, secular music. This was summer of 1988, and my family and I were preparing to move from Springdale to Fort Wayne, Indiana. On one of our last days in town before leaving, Dad took me to TCBY as sort of a temporary salve to ease the anxiety of leaving old friends, making new ones. And as we were scarfing down our frozen yogurts, Dad said, "Let's go to the music store." I silently followed him into the severely air conditioned, sparsely stocked store of gospel music. Dad looked in one section while I walked around the store working on my froyo. After a while, Dad walked over to me and asked, "You ready?" I was down to the cone and I nodded yes. He said, "I think I found something," and showed me the cassette in his hand. It was "I'm Going On" by Commissioned. On the album cover were six well-dressed Black men of varying heights, weights, and hues. They looked like they all met while working at a merry-go-round or oak tree. Today's equivalent of merry-go-round would be maybe Rue 21, and oak tree is more like Men's Warehouse. As a child, I thought Morris Day's song Oak Tree was about the clothing store until I saw the music video and found out it was a dance. So my dad bought I'm Going On, and we headed home listening to it and immediately fell in love with the album on that short 10, 15-minute drive. We didn't know it yet, but it would be the early soundtrack of our pending homesickness. Once Mom heard it, I'm Going On became the official family album. I grew up with family albums. In other words, albums that the whole family listened to almost always together. At home, yes, but especially in the car. When we lived in Denver, Colorado, the family album was Chaka Khan's I Feel For You. When we moved to Ohio from Colorado, it was Anita Baker's Rapture. After we moved to Indiana, it was I'm Going On, then Anita Baker's Giving You the Best That I Got. You know, these were the tapes that stayed stored in the armrest. As you can see, Anita Baker was in heavy rotation. There were many more, but those were the top ones before my mixtape and headphones phase began. These albums were played in our car's tape deck for extended road trips, cross-country moves, and around town errands. It's because of this I can sing so many albums in their entirety. It's like muscle memory. It can be years that I haven't listened to an album. all the way through. But if it's from the shared tape deck era of my life, it comes rushing back when I hear it again. I'm Going On was actually released 3 years before my dad bought our copy, but it was and still is contemporary. The thing about Commissioned is you may not have heard of the band itself, or maybe you've heard of founding member Fred Hammond or even Marvin Sapp. But I guarantee you at least one of your favorite R&B singing groups from the late 80s and all of the 1990s and early 2000s were influenced by Commissioned. I know for a fact they're a huge influence on 112. But you can also hear it with Levert, Guy, New Edition, post Bobby Brown, probably all the male-fronted R&B groups of the 1990s, like Jodeci, Boyz II Men, Portrait, Rude Boys, Shy, UNV, possibly even SWV and Escape. Basically, any group of that time who sang R&B and had dope harmonies. I'm certain Commissioned was their North Star. A big part of that is because so many of these groups came out of the Black church, and Commissioned came out of the Black church, but they sounded like R&B and funk. They were instrumentalists too, so they were like Gospel's Mint Condition, another band that was probably inspired by Commissioned, even though both bands came out around the same time in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Detroit, Michigan, respectively. It took us a while to find our people in Fort Wayne, and part of that was from the trials of learning our way around a new place. Until we did, we played I'm Going On non-stop and sang along to every song. Sometimes I would unbuckle my seatbelt and wedge in the space between mom and dad so we could sing 3-part harmony on "'Tis So Sweet." In fact, Commissioned's "'Tis So Sweet" was the first time I'd ever heard that hymn. When I finally heard the original, I was disappointed. Now I have an appreciation for the original, but Commissioned set the standard for how that song should sound. There are 8 tracks on I'm Going On, but the other family favorites were the title track, Unworthy, I Can See Jesus, You've Got a Friend, and Surely We Need Him. In the early days of our move, we would drive around Fort Wayne, sometimes tearfully singing along with Commissioned, waiting to find our people in this new town. Until we did, that album was a great comfort, and it's still my favorite album by them. I'm a big Fred Hammond fan too, but nothing tops I'm Going On. It came out of nowhere and gave all of its listeners something we didn't know we needed till we couldn't do without it.